Hello, welcome to the third episode of our series on World War One, in which we examine the crucial occasions that occurred in 1916. This year saw some of the bloodiest and most intense battles ever fought, as well as major turning points in the conflict. I'll discuss the terrible Battle of Verdun and the enormous Battle of the Somme, which displayed never-before-seen levels of carnage and human sacrifice. From the 6th to the 8th of December 1915, Joffre held a conference of Chantilly to make battle plans with his Allied counterparts and to coordinate military offensives for 1916. The plan was for the British to support the French in a major summer attack. The British wanted to attack in Belgium, but the French demanded an operation at the point in the Allied line where the two armies met. This was a long 25-mile, 40-kilometre front north and south of the River Somme in northern France. The big push on the Western Front would coincide with attacks by Russia and Italy elsewhere. Unfortunately, this plan was interrupted by events to the southeast on the River Meuse. The Germans beat the Allies to it by launching their own offensive in Verdun. By the beginning of 1916, the war in France, from the Swiss border to the English Channel, had settled into the long slog of trench warfare. Despite the hard conditions in the trenches, General Falcon believed that the key to winning the war lay not in confronting Russia in the east, but in defeating the French in a major battle on the Western Front. In December 1916, Falcon convinced the Kaiser, over the objections of other military leaders such as Paul von Hindenburg, that in combination with unrestricted submarine warfare at sea, a major French loss in the battle would push the British, whom Falcon saw as the most potent of the Allies, out of the war. In Falcon's view, Britain's real weapons in the war were the French, Russian, and Italian armies. He regarded Russia as already paralyzed and Italy as unlikely to affect the outcome of the war, concluding, only France remains. The stage for this epic battle was set against the backdrop of Verdun, a medieval town on the Meuse River. The fortress of Verdun with its surrounding fortifications along the Meuse River was selected because it threatened the main German communication lines, represented a salient in the French defences, and the loss of such citadel would be an enormous blow to French morale. Falcon believed that due to its national significance, the French army would defend it at all cost, that the French would fight to the last man to defend Verdun. By taking territory important to the French defenders, they hoped to instigate large-scale counterattacks. These would then fall victim to mass German artillery, leading to a battle of attrition. Falcon believed that if the battle lasted long enough, it would eventually, quote, lead the French white, end quote, leading to their ultimate defeat. Verdun is a gateway city on the Meuse River, but the French consider it to be a quiet sector. Ignoring intelligence that warned of a possible German attack in the region, French command had begun in 1915 to strip its forces, which they have reduced to a minimum, at Verdun of the heavy artillery. They have dismantled the cannons of its forts and sent them to the hotspots on the front, weakening their defences. In January 1916, French airmen had detected German preparations for the Verdun offensive, and on the 11th of February that year, a French intelligence officer discovered a build-up of German troops on the right bank of the Meuse. As French commanders had been almost exclusively focused on their own offensive plans, their hasty efforts to bolster the defences of Verdun were very nearly too late. Over the next 10 days, thousands of men and dozens of guns were moved to Verdun to oppose the expected German attack. Confronted with a massive logistical challenge, main rail lines to Verdun had been cut or were under constant barrage by German artillery. French officers organised a motorised supply chain on an unprecedented scale, transporting men and material to the front in a fleet of more than 3,000 trucks. The 37-mile, 57-kilometre dirt road connecting the railhead at Battle to Verdun came to be known as La Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way, for its critical role in the French defence. At 4 a.m. on the 21st of February 1916, the battle began with a massive artillery bombardment and a steady advance by troops of the German Fifth Army under Crown Prince Wilhelm. A series of attacks and counterattacks ensued, rapidly transforming Verdun's landscape into a no man's land. It was around this time, late February, that French commander at Verdun, Joseph Joffre, the so-called Victor of the Marne, was set aside in favour of General Philippe Pétain. Unlike Joffre, Pétain was known to oppose the French strategy of offence at all costs. He implemented a defensive strategy. His orders are to dig in and hold on. One of the critical episodes of the battle involved Fort de Mont, a key fortification that was taken over by the German forces almost unopposed early in the battle. This fort, however, was later reclaimed by the French in the bloody and determined assault. Another noteworthy incident was the ruthless struggle for Fort Vaux. The men inside famously held onto their positions with unprecedented courage, even as they had to resort to drinking their own urine when their water supply was depleted. The battle ended on the 18th of December, 1916. Notably, despite suffering shocking casualties, the French prevented the Germans from achieving their strategic goal of bleeding France white. The French soldiers' motto, Ils ne passeront pas, they shall not pass, echoed this national sentiment of determination and resilience. By December, France had won back nearly all the territory it had lost in February. Nicknamed the Mill on the Meuse, the Battle of Verdun was the longest battle of the First World War. The battle lasted for over 9 months. It was one of the costliest and bloodiest engagements in history too. Technically, the Battle of Verdun ended in a French tactical victory due to the successful defense and repulsion of German forces. However, one could argue that there were no real winners, given the astonishing loss of life on both sides and the physical and psychological scars that outlived the battle. It is estimated that the French suffered 162,000 to 542,000 casualties. The Germans had sustained 100,000 to 434,000 casualties. Falken's plan to destroy the French army had failed. He had overestimated the Germans' ability to inflict disproportionate losses. Instead, his men found themselves in a battle of attrition that wore them down as much as the French. The French resistance was stronger than expected. General Philippe Pétain organized a cluttered defense and marshaled resources effectively in what was known as the Noailles system. This involved a continual rotation of troops through Verdun to spread out the losses and sustain the morale of the soldiers. In addition, the French artillery used the creep and barrage tactic effectively. This involved artillery fire moving just ahead of advancing infantry, thereby offering them cover and keeping the enemy pinned down. The closing stages of the battle saw an aggressive French counteroffensive taking advantage of the German distraction at the Somme and in Transylvania. The French's use of massive artillery and innovative tactics during their counterattacks led to the recapture of lost fortresses and pushing back the German forces. In the terrible destruction of what the French soldiers called, quote, furnace, end quote, Pétain succeeded in halting the Germans. The pastoral landscape surrounding the city had been permanently transformed, and 9 villages were destroyed. After the war, the villages were memorialized as having, quote, died for France, end quote, and, although uninhabited, continued to be administered by mayors to preserve their existence as administrative entities. An area covering some 65 square miles, 170 square kilometers on the Verdun Ridge was declared a zone rouge, red zone, because of the presence of unexploded ordnance, and development within it was prohibited. The land was deemed too physically and environmentally damaged by the conflict for human habitation. In the 21st century, the French Interior Minister estimated that over 10 million shells remained in the soil around Verdun, and bomb-clearing units continued to remove some 40 tons of unexploded munitions from the area annually. Especially dangerous were chemical rounds, which were largely indistinguishable from explosive shells. Their contents retained their toxicity over time, and they were prone to leak when discovered and handled. The French government has a special munitions clearing agency called Département de Déminage. The department clears unexploded bombs and artillery shells that litter the Zone Rouge and other parts of the country that suffered during the conflict. It was estimated that at existing rates of clearance, the miners reckon they have 300 years of work ahead of them before they have cleared the entire battlefield. Verdun marked a strategic turning point for the Germans. Their failure to achieve their objective of bleeding France dry led to the replacement of Erich von Falken, who was lambasted for his tactics at Verdun. Falken resigned on August 1916 and was replaced by General Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff. Joffre's prestige began to wane as well. The evident lack of French preparation for the German attack on Verdun, for which he was held responsible, prepared his downfall. Though the French suffered huge losses, Petain's careful husbanding of his troops avoided even greater bloodshed. Despite his successes and his concern for his soldiers, it was General Robert Nivelle who was chosen to replace General Joffre as commander of French forces in December that year. Almost 3/4 of the French army fought at Verdun. It was a Franco-German battle, but it also involved colonial forces. The sheer scope and violence of the fighting here made it one of the major battles of the First World War. In fact, in people's minds, the Battle of Verdun came to symbolize the Great War, a culmination of battlefield brutality. It summed up every aspect of the Great War and turned Verdun into the most iconic of all places of remembrance. With the harrowing details of the Battle of Verdun behind us, we now shift our focus from the trenches of France to the waters of the North Sea. Just before 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the 31st of May 1916, a British naval force commanded by Vice Admiral David Beatty confronts a squadron of German ships led by Admiral Franz von Hipper, some 75 miles off the Danish coast. The two squadrons opened fire on each other simultaneously, beginning the opening phase of the greatest naval battle of World War I, the Battle of Jutland, the only time the British and German fleets of dreadnought battleships came to blows. After the Battle of Doggerbank in January 1915, the German Navy chose not to confront the numerically superior British Royal Navy in a major battle for more than a year, preferring to rest the bulk of its strategy at sea on its lethal U-boat submarines. In May 1916, however, with the majority of the British Grand Fleet anchored far away at Scapa Flow, off the northern coast of Scotland, the commander of the German High Seas Fleet, Vice Admiral Reynard Scheer, believed the time was right to resume attacks on the British coastline. Confident that his communications were securely coded, Scheer ordered 19 U-boat submarines to position themselves for a raid on the North Sea coastal city of Sunderland, while using air reconnaissance crafts to keep an eye on the British fleet's movement from Scapa Flow. Bad weather hampered the airships, however, and Scheer called off the raid, instead ordering his fleet to head north to the Skagerrak, a waterway located between Norway and northern Denmark, off the Jutland Peninsula, where they could attack Allied shipping interests and, if fortunate, punch a hole in the stringent British blockade. Unbeknownst to Scheer, a newly created intelligence unit located within an old building of the British Admiralty known as Room 40 had cracked the German codes and warned the British Grand Fleet's commander, Admiral John Rushworth Jellicoe, of Scheer's intentions. Consequently, on the night of the 30th of May, a British fleet set out from Scapa Flow, bound for positions off the Skagerrak. At 2:20 p.m. on the 31st of May, Beatty, leading a British squadron, spotted Hipper's warships. As each squadron manoeuvred south to better its positions, shots were fired, but neither side opened fire until 3:48 that afternoon. The initial phase of the gun battle lasted 55 minutes, during which 2 British battlecruisers, Indefatigable and Queen Mary, were destroyed, killing over 2,000 sailors. At 4:43 p.m, Hipper's squadron was joined by the remainder of the German fleet, commanded by Scheer. Beatty was forced to fight a delaying action for the next hour until Jellicoe could arrive with the rest of the Grand Fleet. With both fleets facing off in their entirety, a great battle of naval strategy began among the 4 commanders, particularly between Jellicoe and Scheer. As sections of the 2 fleets continued to engage each other throughout the late evening and the early morning of the 1st of June, Jellicoe manoeuvred 96 of the British ships into a V shape surrounding 59 German ships. Hitler's flagship Lutzler was disabled by 24 direct hits but was able, before it sank, to sink the British battlecruiser Invincible. Just after 6:30 on the evening of the 1st of June, Scheer's fleet executed a previously planned withdrawal under cover of darkness to their base at the German port of Wilhelmshaven, ending the battle and cheating the British of the major naval success they had envisioned. The Battle of Jutland, or the Battle of Skagerrak, as it was known to the Germans, engaged a total of 100,000 men aboard 250 ships over the course of 72 hours. The Germans, giddy from the glory of Scheer's brilliant escape, claimed it as a victory for their high seas fleet. The victory of the Skagerrak was celebrated in the press. Children were given a holiday and the nation celebrated. At first, the British press agreed, but the truth was not so clear-cut. The German Navy lost 11 ships, including a battleship and a battlecruiser, and suffered 3,058 casualties. The British sustained heavier losses, with 14 ships sunk, including 3 battlecruisers, and 6,784 casualties. 10 more German ships had suffered heavy damage, and by the 2nd of June, only 10 ships that had been involved in the battle were ready to leave port again. Jellicoe, on the other hand, could have put 23 to sea. On the 4th of July, 1916, Scheer reported to the German High Command that further fleet action was not an option, and that submarine warfare was Germany's best hope for victory at sea. Despite the missed opportunities and heavy losses, the Battle of Jutland had left British naval superiority on the North Sea intact. The German High Seas Fleet would make no further attempts to break the Allied blockade or to engage the Grand Fleet for the remainder of World War I. Having navigated through the intense maritime conflict of the Battle of Jutland, we now return to the Western Front, where one of the most significant and devastating battles of World War I unfolded. The Battle of Somme, marked by its unprecedented scale and the introduction of new military technologies, would become a symbol of the immense human cost of the war. For many in Britain, the resulting battle remains the most painful and infamous episode of the First World War. As I mentioned before, in December 1915, Allied commanders had met to discuss strategies for the upcoming year and agreed to launch a joint French and British attack in the region of the River Somme in the summer of 1916. This major offensive required both men and munitions. In 1914, Kitchener began a massive recruiting campaign to raise these volunteer new armies. Great throngs of British men lined up to enlist in the war effort. This included Pals battalions, made up of men who were friends, relatives, and workmates recruited from the same communities. After around a year of training, most of these men began to see active service from late 1915 and early 1916, particularly on the Western Front. Until then, the regulars, supported by the territorials and reservists, took the leading role. The Battle of the Somme, the largest offensive the British Army had yet launched, was the first to be fought by a largely citizen army made up of civilian volunteers rather than professional soldiers. This meant that many of the attacking British infantry did not have battlefield experience. The government knew that the war wasn't going to end anytime soon and that there were going to be lots of more casualties. Thus, voluntary enlistment was eventually replaced by conscription. When the war broke out, it was generally thought that the war would be over within 6 months. However, by the end of 1914, well over 1 million soldiers of various nationalities had been killed on the battlefields of Europe, and a final victory was not in sight for either the Allies or the Central Powers. On the Western Front, the combatants had settled down in the trenches for a terrible war of attrition. Maimed and shell-shocked troops returning to Britain with tales of machine guns, artillery barrages, and poison gas seriously dampened the enthusiasm of potential new volunteers. With the aim of raising enough men to launch a decisive offensive against Germany, Britain replaced voluntary service with conscription in January 1916, when it passed an act calling for the enlistment of all unmarried men between the ages of 18 and 41. Continental Europe mass armies were all built on this type of conscription, but it felt very alien to the British. After Germany launched a massive offensive of its own against Verdun in February, Britain expanded the Military Service Act, calling for the conscription of all men. married and unmarried between the ages of 18 and 41. Intense German pressure on the French at Verdun throughout 1916 made action on the Somme increasingly urgent. Thus, to relieve the pressure on the French, the Somme offensive was launched earlier than planned with the inexperienced new armies. The French were still attacking the south, but the desperate situation at Verdun reduced their role in the operation. The British plan of attack was primarily down to two commanders. Sir Douglas Haig gave the overall direction of the battle as Commander-in-Chief, with Sir Henry Rawlinson commanding 4th Army, which was to attack on the first day. Rawlinson advocated a more limited approach to the attack, but the more optimistic Haig wanted to achieve more distant objectives. Like the British Army as a whole, neither commander had been involved in an offensive on this scale before. Haig's plan was for the British 4th Army to break through in the centre, while the 3rd Army in the north and the French 6th Army to the south made diversionary attacks. If successful, the reserve army, including cavalry, would then exploit this gap and roll up the German line. The Germans were stationed behind a formidable set of defences, the strength of which had been underestimated by Allied intelligence. Thus, on the 24th of June 1916, a preliminary bombardment began which was to last for 7 days. General Sir Douglas Haig's artillery was expected to destroy German defences and guns and cut the barbed wire in front of the enemy lines. When the attack began, it would provide a creeping barrage behind which the infantry could advance. The British believed their opponents would be so shattered by this bombardment that the infantry would simply have to walk over no man's land and occupy the German trenches. The British had overestimated the power of the artillery though. The guns were too thinly spread for the task in hand, and although they fired 1.5 million shells, 2 of them were shrapnel, which threw out steel balls when they exploded. While devastating against troops in the open, shrapnel was largely ineffective against concrete dugouts and the men sheltering in them. A lot of the shells were also defective. It has been estimated that around 30% of the shells failed to explode. As a result, the German defences were not destroyed, and in many places the barbed wire remained uncut. The Allies also used mines to destroy the German lines before the battle. One was detonated at Hawthorne Ridge 10 minutes before 0 hour, unwittingly signalling to the Germans that an attack was coming. The mine left a crater 300 feet across. Since the introduction of trenches, each side has tried to tunnel under the enemy and blow them up. I know, it's insane. Everyone listens for sound coming from underground, which could mean either the enemy is barreling towards you or that you're closing in on his trench. This time, British sappers have dug a tunnel nearly a mile long beneath the German trenches, filling it with 24 tons of powerful explosives. But the Germans have heard the sappers and withdrawn. The most powerful underground mine of the war left no victims. At 7:30 a.m. on the 1st of July 1916, the British artillery, which have been shelling the German lines for a week, held their fire, opening the way for an assault. The young, inexperienced men were afraid. To reassure them, Captain Billy Neville was the first man over, dribbling a football across no man's land until he was killed by German machine gun fire. 14 British divisions attacked. In most cases, they were unable to keep up with the artillery barrage that was supposed to take them through to the German trenches. The British infantry could not cross no man's land and reach the parapet before the enemy did because of their heavy load. The infantrymen were so heavily laden that they could not move faster than walk. Each man carried about 66 pounds, 30 kg of equipment, a load that often amounted to more than a half of the soldier's own body weight, making it difficult to get out of a trench, impossible to move much quicker than a slow walk, or to rise and lie down quickly. Their slow pace gave the Germans time to scramble out of their dugouts once the barrage had lifted, man their trenches, and open fire. The race to no man's land was lost before it even started, and the battle soon after. Haig's infantry were welcomed by a storm of machine gun, rifle, and artillery fire. Most of them were gunned down. They suffered nearly 60,000 casualties that day. 20,000 British soldiers were dead and 40,000 wounded. It was the heaviest day of casualties in British military history. Although the French had made great progress in the south and there had been some local successes, in most places the attack had been a failure. Without British success, little could be done to exploit their gains. With the French still under pressure at Verdun, there was no question of calling off the offensive. More attacks were mounted between the 3rd and 13th of July, and a further 25,000 men were lost. But gradually, the British tactics improved. On the 14th of July, 4 British divisions made a dawn attack on Longueval Ridge. Supported by an intense artillery bombardment, they caught the Germans by surprise, and by mid-morning they had captured the ridge. Attacks continued through the summer, mostly on a series of individual objectives, with the Germans frequently mounting counterattacks of their own. The Big Push became a slow, grinding struggle of attrition. In some areas, the battle became a slugging match that lasted for months. Typical of this type of fighting was the struggle for Delville Wood. On the 14th of July, the 1st South African Brigade, 3,153 officers and men, entered Delville Wood as an extension of operations around nearby Trones and Bernafay Woods. After 6 days of vicious fighting in awful conditions, only around 750 officers and men remained unharmed. For 6 days and 5 nights, a soldier was killed every minute, with one South African soldier dying every 3 minutes. Troops of many regiments continued the struggle until September. All suffered huge casualties. The wood was subsequently nicknamed Devil's Wood by the Allies. On the 15th of September, the British unveiled a new weapon, capable of piercing the barbed wire and opening the way for the infantry. To mislead enemy spies, they referred to these armoured assault vehicles as tanks. At first, the Germans were terrified, but slow and vulnerable and deployed in too small numbers, the early models proved easy targets for German artillery. They advanced about 2 kilometers, 1.5 miles, but no breakthrough was made. The early tanks were slow and unreliable, shown by the fact that of the 49 tanks deployed for the battle, only 25 moved forward at the start of the attack. As production increased and reliability improved, they were used in greater numbers. France began development in late 1915, eventually creating the Renault FT light tank. This was the first to use a fully rotating turret that contained the tank's main armament, the basis of tank design ever since. By contrast, Germany lagged. German forces often salvaged British and French tanks, both for research purposes and to use on the battlefield. Finally, on the 18th of November 1916, after the weather had deteriorated, Haig shut down the offensive. Except for its effect of diverting German troops from the Battle of Verdun, the offensive was a miserable disaster. For an advance of 13 kilometers, 8 miles, the British Empire had suffered 420,000 casualties and the French 200,000. As I mentioned before, most of the attacking British infantry had no combat experience. One French officer wrote on the 10th of July, "The British infantry is very brave, but undergoing a costly apprenticeship." Many of the PAL's battalions were not to see their first major action until the first day of the Battle of the Somme on the 1st of July, and for many of them, their first battle would be their last. The huge losses among the PAL's battalions on the Somme plunged many British communities into grief. With the introduction of conscription, the close-knit nature of the PAL's battalions was never to be replicated. The battle exemplified the futile slaughter and military incompetence of the First World War. Yet Haig had no option but to fight on the Somme. Abandoning the French would have greatly tested the unity of the Entente, and despite his controversial tactics, the battle provided a tough lesson in how to fight a large-scale war. A more professional and effective army emerged from the battle, and the tactics developed there, including the use of tanks and creeping barrages, would later play a crucial role in shaping the outcome of the war. One German officer described the Battle of the Somme as, quote, "the muddy grave of the German field army," end quote. German losses were at least 450,000 killed and wounded, and that army never fully recovered from the loss of so many experienced junior and non-commissioned officers. The tragedy of the Somme battle was that the best soldiers, the stoutest hearted men, were lost. Their numbers were replaceable, their spiritual worth never could be, said an unidentified German soldier. The heavy losses at Verdun, combined with even greater casualties suffered on the Somme, created a manpower crisis within the army that would become increasingly difficult to resolve as the war continued. The The strength of the Anglo-French offensive on the Somme surprised Falcon and limited his men's response there to holding on to positions as best as they could. The losses at Verdun and the Somme had depleted the offensive capabilities of the German army. In the west, it would have to go over to the strategic defensive for 1917. Germany and its allies would focus their offensive attentions elsewhere. During the Somme fighting and through the winter months, the Germans built a formidable new defensive system called the Hindenburg Line. It ran from Arras to La Fore near Soissons on the River Aisne. In the spring of 1917, they retreated to this new position, which shortened their front and freed up divisions for use elsewhere. This move was a direct consequence of troop shortages resulting from the Somme fighting. As 1916 ended, World War I had already exacted a staggering toll. The battles of Verdun and the Somme had demonstrated the immense human cost of the conflict, as millions of lives were lost in the bloodiest year of the war so far. Amidst the stalemate on the Western Front, signs of unrest began to stir in Russia, hinting at the revolutionary upheaval that would soon reshape the course of the war and the fate of the empires. As we look ahead to 1917, the world stands on the brink of profound change, with the war's impact reaching far beyond the battlefield. See you soon.